Community Planning Conversations today is with Todd Litman, who's visiting our community through the sponsorship of our Mass Transit District. Todd, I've heard you a couple of times since you've arrived in town, and you describe our community as having good bones and a nice grid layout of streets. What do you mean by the fact that we have good bones here in the community for transportation?
Until about the middle of the 20th century, most communities were built for people to walk and ride transit, what you would call a multimodal community. And so you have a dense street network, you have neighborhoods where there are schools and shops within the neighborhoods. You don't have a lot of dead-end streets. Now, in the last half century or so, a lot of the development has been much more automobile oriented. And that means that you have more spread out development, less orientation toward pedestrians, so the streets aren't very pleasant for walking. You have less transit orientation, so you don't have as much activity in the downtowns. And often the schools are located outside of the neighborhoods. People have to feel like they have to drive their children to school. You're lucky in your community because most of the community was built before automobile-oriented design standards came into place. A lot of your streetscape, a lot of your landscape is oriented toward pedestrian travel, and it makes it a good place for cycling and public transit access.
So even though you've been here just a short time, but I know that you've been driven around the community, so you're looking at our community with an outside lens, which is often very helpful. What would you do to build upon this good bone structure to put us back into the position of a multimodal community?
Well, I think there's a lot you could do to create what we call more complete streets. So that means that your streets, especially the arterials, the busier streets, are designed so that they can accommodate pedestrians. So they're nicer to walk on, and that they can accommodate cycling, and that they give that they accommodate transit vehicles. That it's a good place to hop a bus. So that's part of it. Part of it is the physical design. Another aspect is that to the degree that you can improve travel options, so you're improving walking, you're improving cycling, you're improving public transit, you also have to give people who have the option of driving a reason to leave their car at home and use, say, van pooling or bicycling or public transit for some of their trips. So there are a number of strategies. I work a lot with helping communities or businesses design the kind of incentives. It's things like if an employee is offered a free parking space, that's essentially a subsidy of automobile commuting. And it's only fair that an employee who's offered a free parking space should have the option of asking for the cash instead. So right now, there are a lot of people who commute by car who should be given the option of getting, say, $50 or $100 a month in cash if they were to use an alternative form of transportation. And when you do that, typically about 20% of the car commutes shift to either walking or cycling or public transit or ride sharing, and that's good for everybody. So those are the kind of strategies that I think make a lot of sense. They're very cost effective. They benefit everybody. If you shift mode, you're better off. You're responding in a positive way to this positive incentive. And if you keep driving, you're better off because there's less traffic congestion and fewer parking problems, and the roads are safer. So I'm very interested in putting together, I think that a community like this could do a lot to put together a package of incentives and improvements so that you would see a gradual reduction in the amount of driving that goes on.
But if I looked at the economic efficiency of my time, even getting $40 or $50 a month, and I'd say, gee, does that make up for the fact that my 15-minute commute in a car is going to take me 45 minutes on the bus?
Well, Not every trip is going to shift. Not every commuter is going to change, but there are inevitably some trips that you would call marginal. You could go either way. And there's a lot that can be done to improve your travel options so that you would find it more attractive to take the bus. For example, giving buses priority in traffic, improving the walking conditions around the destinations, making it easier for you to get information on on where a bus is going and how to catch the bus. All those things can help make it easier. Now let me turn that question around. When I ask people, would you give up driving? Very few people are willing to give up their car, right? But if I ask you, compared with the amount of driving that you currently do, would you rather do more driving or less driving? What do you think most people choose?
But that's not a fair question because you're not telling me what my alternatives are.
Okay, what if we improve walking and cycling, public transit, and van pool service and rewarded you for when you choose the alternatives? Do you think that there are some trips that you're currently making by car that might shift?
Probably not, because in our country they don't allow pets on mass transit.
Right, okay, so we need to talk with the transit agency to figure out ways to accommodate you. Or you might be one of those people that doesn't shift, and you're benefiting because your neighbors have shifted and they're reducing the traffic congestion and the parking problems that you face.
There's two aspects that I don't think you focused on. One of them being you haven't discussed that the mass transit might shift the way they design their bus route so it doesn't take 45 minutes for
Absolutely.
a route. And the second is sort of a philosophy in the United States that doesn't accommodate people bringing pets on mass transit as compared to Europe, where one of the reasons that enables a high ridership on mass transit is the tolerance of people bringing their pets onto mass transit.
Sure, you're absolutely right. Public transit service enjoys economies of scale. The more people ride it, the more service you can justify. The more service you can justify, the more frequent the service, the better the service, the larger area it covers, the faster it becomes for you, and therefore more people ride it. It's a positive feedback cycle. And so you're absolutely right that there is a lot that could be done to improve the quality of service that's available. But in order to do that, in order to have more frequent service and to serve you better and to serve more people in the region, you need to give middle-class people who own a car an incentive to leave that car at home and ride public transit more frequently. And so then your service grows. It's a chicken and egg situation. The question is, do you start by improving service and expect the ridership to grow, or do you start putting in the incentives and that starts justifying more service? And you have to do both. You have to improve service. You have to give people incentives. Now, in terms of pets, very important issue. I'm a pet owner, something that I relate to myself. A lot of transit agencies now do allow small animals in a carrier on their vehicles. And that's an improvement because in the past they were stricter about this. And in fact, some transit agencies are doing a lot more to make sure that people are accommodated. Let me give you just a couple examples. One of the transit agencies in Boulder, Colorado, they let their drivers play music. And so it becomes much more fun to ride the bus. Another example is in some communities, stores deliver. So right now, you might say, well, I can't ride the bus because I'm going shopping and I'm going to get 2 or 3 bags of groceries, and I don't feel comfortable carrying them on the bus. If more of the stores in your community offer delivery service, as they do in the town I live in, it would be easy for you to walk or bicycle or take the bus when you're shopping. So there's a lot of support components. Things like being able to carry pets, having delivery services, having really easy access to information about where to catch the bus and how to use the bus, the walkability of the destinations, those are all components of making it easier for you to ride public transit.
One of the things that I notice in my own behavior when I'm visiting other communities or countries is that the frequency and convenience of the mass transit is really the tipping point. I'll give you an example. Your own country in Vancouver. The fact that the mass transit is so frequent and so easy to get on and off that going shopping, to your example of grocery shopping and how many bags of groceries or whatever you're bringing home, it's so easy to go home and take some things home and get back on the mass transit and then go to another, distance of your tripping, that this aspect of it seems to be a real key ingredient for getting people to be willing to use mass transit the same way in Europe. The incredible frequency that I was in Berlin, and typical American thing, I misread the LED sign and missed the train that I was supposed to get on to go to Amsterdam. And I thought, well, that does the travel there. Went over and explained my situation, and the person on the platform said, well, just take this train that's about to leave. It goes faster than the one you were scheduled to be on. It will get to point C, at which place you get off, and your train, your original train, will then be arriving shortly afterwards, and you can just get on your original train. Had that happened in the United States, I would have been lost for a whole day of travel. We have a long way to go before we get to this point in mass transit where something is so convenient. Even though I had made this error, I could just still get to Amsterdam and arrive at the time that I was supposed to arrive.
You're absolutely right. What we're talking about is creating a multimodal transportation system where you have excellent quality services for people that, even when they're not traveling by automobile. And there are a number of components. And the way I think of it is, in order to be successful, we have to reach the point where normal middle-class people who could afford, say, 2 or 3 cars for their household and could afford to rely entirely on automobile transportation, choose to leave their car at home for some of their trips. And you're right. In Europe, they've never lost that, and some cities in North America are doing fairly well. And a lot of cities now in North America are learning how to do this. They're recreating a more multimodal system, and it has a number of components. And part of it is the frequency of the transit service, but an equally important component is the walkability of destinations. So there's nothing worse than taking a bus, getting off, and there's no sidewalk. And it's a mile or two to the suburban destination that you're going to. And you don't feel safe. Where in a more multimodal community, your activity centers are all on the bus services. There's more compact development. Walking conditions are good. Your parking management, you have much more parking management, and that allows more compact development. And employers are more supportive of public transit. So unlike most employers here in North America, in other countries you often find that the employer is willing to pay a portion of the public transit fare. And so it simply creates parity. It means that, yes, you can get a free parking space, or you can get the transit pass.
And how did you develop this interest in transportation? You were telling me that you have a background in environmental sciences. So,
well, I actually started off as a bicycle shop manager. I was very interested in bicycling, and I was asked to be the lobbyist for our state bicycle organization in Washington State. And I found myself spending a lot of time talking with conventional transportation professionals to trying to show them that bicycling deserved respect. And most of the ways, the techniques that they use to evaluate transportation investments and road designs didn't give much respect for cycling. And so I got interested. How do you show the value to society if somebody drives less and bicycles more? And that led me to think about, well, it led me to study the economic analysis of transportation. And I expanded my analysis. So I started off really just thinking about bicycling. But that got me interested, okay, if bicycling saves so many dollars per trip, how does that compare with a walking trip or a public transit trip or a carpooling trip? And so I created, my master's thesis was a comprehensive model looking at how you measure the costs of different forms of transportation and therefore the savings that result if you shift transportation patterns. Well, that's been a very interesting, that's led to a very interesting career because it turns out what sounds like a very dry academic subject touches on everything that we do. So, for example, the experience that people have in their community, their ability to get to know their neighbors, the costs to their household, the affordability of housing, the economic development of a community, these are all strongly affected by our transportation and land use decisions. So what started off as a fairly narrow interest in cycling has broadened out to consider a whole range of issues. The term that is sometimes used is sustainable transportation planning, but it can also be called smart growth or simply better transportation, more livable communities.
And how did you get to Victoria?
Well, I was lucky enough to marry a Canadian, and my wife liked the idea of moving back to her area, and I was offered an attractive job at one point there. So that was the motivation. It seemed like destiny at the time. But you know, as a planner and a geographer and somebody that's interested in these issues, I look at different communities and, you know, I certainly feel lucky living in Victoria because it's a very nice community. But, you know, I think I could live anywhere because community, more than anything, is what you create, what an individual creates. So sure, the landscape and the cityscape and the type of transportation system you have, those can be important. Those can affect your life experience. But, you know, it isn't as if moving to a particularly nice place will necessarily make people happy. We need a combination of wonderful communities and the positive attitude that people can have where they say, I'm going to make this community a better place. And so this is what I hope I'm instilling or communicating to people is that every community deserves to become a better place.
And you're associated with the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, which is basically a research institute. Just briefly, some of the areas that the Institute is researching related to transportation.
Right. Well, I'm very involved in looking at how to measure, how to evaluate transportation decisions. So transportation planning, engineering, and economic analysis. And one of the things that I get involved in is the conventional planning practices. They tend to undervalue alternative modes. So they tend to undervalue investments in walking and cycling and public transit and these kind of mobility management programs. And so I'm very interested in looking at those, what I consider to be a planning or a market distortion, and seeing ways to correct them. I'm also very interested in looking at what we call smart growth. So how the relationship between transportation and land use and how we can use that in more positive ways to create better communities, more livable communities, and more multimodal communities. An area I've done quite a bit of research on recently is looking at how to encourage more efficient use of parking facilities, what we call parking management. And in fact,
Is it, if you would just hold it up?
yeah,
Yes.
this is my new book, Parking Management Best Practices, which is published by Planners Press. I don't expect too many people are going to run out and buy it because it's a fairly, or too many people in the audience, because it is a fairly specialized technical book.
But as we always mention on this program, this book can be found in the City and Landscape Architecture Library at the university, and as residents of the state,
Right. Now,
you have access to that library. So
absolutely.
it's an excellent resource for people to go back and look at these
Right. And
things that you're talking about today.
And here's what this book and some of the other materials that I've produced can do is it allows you to figure out cost-effective ways to reduce the amount of land that needs to be devoted to parking facilities. That can make a huge difference in terms of the design of your community, the affordability of housing, the ability to encourage alternative forms of transportation. It's a lever that can be very important. Now, another area that I've been doing a lot of research on recently is on how to create healthier communities. And I was recently...
Why don't you define how you're using the term healthy communities?
Right. A healthier community means people are less likely to die in a car crash or be injured in a car crash. They're getting more physical exercise. The Surgeon General of the United States recommends or says that to be healthy, people need about 30 minutes a day of moderate physical exercise most days of the week. And what we're finding is that because, and the third component is reducing exposure to air pollution. Okay, those are the three specific aspects that we looked at in our study. And it turns out that that there are certain community design features that affect those three factors. So we can design a community where people are more likely to get exercise and as a result less likely to be overweight, and where people are significantly less likely to be in a car crash, and where the pollution emissions and exposure to pollution are reduced. And it ties in very closely with the concepts around smart growth and livable communities, because it turns out that the more multimodal communities where more resources are devoted to walking conditions and to public transit service, to ride sharing, where your neighborhoods have services within walking distance of more homes, those are the kind of neighborhoods where people are healthier. And it turns out to be quite significant that we can reduce traffic fatality risks by a very large amount. We can significantly increase the portion of the population that's getting that basic physical fitness, and we can reduce pollution emissions by a fairly significant amount by creating these more smarter growth communities. What this does is it shifts some of the debate. In the past, traffic safety discussions were primarily oriented toward changing the design of cars or changing the design of roads so that when you crashed, you were less likely to be injured. The smart growth approach says we're going to reduce the total amount of driving. We're going to reduce the traffic speeds. So when there is a crash, people are less likely to be injured. And we're going to reduce the need for high-risk drivers, such as teenage boys or young adults, people who are older, who are losing their ability to drive, and people that have a history of being drunken driving. In a smart growth community, it becomes feasible to reduce their driving, either not allow them to drive at all or encourage them to use alternative forms of transportation.
Well, you've made the economic argument, which is usually the argument that tilts citizen decision makers, but that isn't the pattern that is happening. So what do we have to do to convince these citizen decision makers that this is in the best interest of creating a livable community for everybody?
Right. Well, I think we have a very positive message. We can say that certain transportation and land use policies are affordable, they create a healthier community, they increase economic activity and the value in a community, they reduce energy consumption and air pollution, and in fact, a lot of people like them. A lot of people would rather live in a multimodal community, in a more walkable neighborhood, in a place where they don't have to chauffeur their children everywhere, where if for whatever reason they can't drive on a particular day, they know that they can hop the bus and get around. These are all really positive things, and I think a lot of people value them. So it's really about educating people, educating the professionals and the public officials, and also informing the general public about the benefits that they can gain, that everybody can gain by reforming our transportation and land use systems so that they're more balanced.
But the professional doesn't make the final decision. It's the citizen planner that makes the decision. And a previous conversation that I had on this program was with a board member of the Champaign School Board. And the solution for the high school is to put it out on the edge of town.
Right.
That's totally counter to all of the arguments that you've put forward from every aspect, whether it's from the economic side or the livable community side, because it will generate all kinds of problems. Now, how do we reach the decision makers on a school board who are going to put a high school out on the edge of town? It's not just this community. This happens across the United States, or the new elementary school way out in the cornfields.
That's right. And let me summarize the way it looks to that particular public official. They're saying the land is cheaper out at the edge of town, so it saves money if we build the school outside of town. Okay? The downside is that means virtually everybody that's going to that school, whether they're staff or students, is going to have to drive, right? So you're talking about a reduction in land costs, but a very large increase in transportation costs. So you, that is your community, would be better off if you can find some way to convince the school board that those short-term savings aren't worth the long-term costs. And especially when you bring in factors like health, that having all those high school kids drive out to the edge of town, that means they're more likely to get into accidents. It means that they're not getting as much physical exercise. It means that you're producing more air pollution and you're consuming more energy. And it means that those households are going to have to spend more because they're either going to have to chauffeur their kids out to school or they're going to have to buy their kids a car. So the cost savings, the land cost savings, are actually tiny compared with the additional costs that decision is going to impose. So to the degree that you can educate people about the very large long-term costs associated with that kind of sprawl-oriented land use decision, and change the institutions so that the school board takes into account the students' transportation costs and the accident risk and and these long-term, the contradiction that it imposes from your strategic land use planning objectives. That's what will really make the difference, changing the way that we make these decisions. But I can't tell you how to do it. I'm the outside expert. I'm visiting your community. I'm enjoying the visit to your community. I can share some ideas, but it's up to you to figure out how to apply them here.
Well, let's take some of your argument that you've been making and apply it to a small rural community. I heard you talking about how rural communities really might not have transportation issues because they're small and you can get around them. My department and the students in the department are working with a small rural community that's totally surrounded by cornfields as far as one can see. And their concept is they need some new housing, and one of the targeted population is the older people that they would like to bring into the community. However, in their concept of housing placement, it's just scattered all around the community. So even though it's not a large community, the walkability for an older person or a physically challenged person then becomes quite large. They'll never be able to support any mass transit, whatsoever. How do you work with a community like that to help them better understand that maybe that's not the best approach, and a more concentrated housing approach might work for the benefit of their livable community?
Sure, that's a great example. What you want to strive for is creating a village. A village means you've got people that live close enough together, they're in convenient walking distance, and you have your services concentrated there. So you have at least a store, maybe a couple stores, you have, if possible, a medical clinic, you have a transit stop. Now, the transit stop doesn't necessarily need to be regular buses. It could be that you have van pooling, and it's a place where you know that every morning at 6:30 or 7 or 7:30 that people are going to be stopping there to pick up riders to go into town. It could also be, you could also think in terms of encouraging carpooling in that area. And a lot of rural communities have a lot of carpooling that goes on informally. That means people just share rides, going shopping. They'll know that certain people need rides and certain people can offer rides. And maybe you can help formalize that so it becomes easier for people to carpool. And in some communities, they're actually opening up the school buses for non-students. So for example, if somebody who lives in the town wants to go shopping, they know that they can, as long as there's a seat there, they can hop on the school bus. So those are some examples. They're, I can't tell you what's going to work in this particular community. It's an interesting problem, but it does turn out that there's a lot that can be done even in rural communities to improve transportation options and use land use design to create more accessible neighborhoods.
In your broad-based experience of looking at communities, not just here in the United States, but in your own country, Canada, or even beyond these borders, name a couple of communities that Champaign-Urbana could look toward as some good models to capture some ideas of what those communities are doing or have done or are in the process of doing.
Sure. Let me tell you a couple. One is Boulder, Colorado. It's another university town, and they're really on the forefront of trying to create a more efficient transportation system and use the bus or make it attractive for middle class people that own a car, to choose to ride public transit or to bicycle for some of their trips. Another example is...
Wait, before you leave that, how have they gone about doing that?
Well, they started off by asking people in town, what would it take, what kind of bus service do you want that would be attractive to you? And they identified quite a few features that make a bus nicer. They gave the buses names. They allow the drivers to play music on the bus. They arranged bulk purchase by employers and by neighborhoods. So a lot of people, the majority of people in Boulder, have already paid for their transit fare. They either because of where they live or where they work or where they go to school, they get what's essentially a free transit pass as part of that package. And so it becomes very easy for people to hop on the bus. In addition, they've done a lot to improve walking and cycling conditions, and they've worked with a lot of the employers to encourage so that employers work with their employees to use alternative forms of transportation.
Have these communities, or have you in your research looked at the perceived feeling of safety in buses and even in light rail? The Hiawatha line up in Minneapolis allows this, and that is the painting of advertising on windows so that people cannot see into the train or bus.
Right. Well, safety and security are very, very important on with any public transit service, and also for walking and cycling and any transportation service. Now, here's the interesting thing: a lot of people basically assume that it's safer to drive, and they couldn't be more wrong. It turns out that people who live in transit-oriented communities or people who ride transit are far safer than people who rely entirely on automobile travel or who live in more sprawled communities in terms of traffic fatality rates. So just keep in mind that it's far safer to ride public transit than it is to drive. Now, in terms of security, usually on the bus, you're pretty safe. The bus drivers are public officials that have every reason to be interested in the passenger safety. They are very concerned about safety. And all the statistics that I've seen indicate that riding a bus is very safe. The risk associated with transit use is more when you're walking to and waiting for the bus. That becomes more of an issue. And that becomes a street design or neighborhood design issue. That is, how can you create safer streets where it feels safe to walk down the street and it feels safe to wait for a bus? And the research that I've seen, the analysis that I've seen indicates that the more there are people walking on the street, the safer those streets are. That is what we call, a more lively street means that everybody is safer who's on that street. So part of improving the security of transit riders is to create more vibrant neighborhoods, more vibrant downtowns where there are people there, middle class, normal people who are also concerned about safety, people that have cell phones, that are all walking down the street all at the same time, and then the space becomes self-patrolling.
Well, let me clarify the question I'm trying to ask you. There is a lot of research out of the medical school at Harvard on the lack of perceived safety when people are on mass transit where the windows are painted with advertising, because if something is happening to them on that mass transit, nobody on the street could see it.
Right.
And mass transit districts look that they're making a lot of money on advertising by doing this, but women in particular really don't want to ride on that kind of mass transit because they really do not feel safe. Even though they can see out, it's the fact that people can't see in.
Well, I can't really address that because that's a perception of safety. What I can tell you is that there is almost no safer way to travel than being on a bus, and that the bus drivers are working to ensure the safety of all the passengers, including passengers when they step off the bus. I mean, it isn't as if there is no effort to provide safety. Now, if there's a perception that what we call wrapped bus, wrapped advertising is a security risk, well, then part of the solution might be to educate people about the safety of riding on bus, or it may be to change the policy so that the buses don't have that kind of advertising. But again, my key concern is what is the true not the perceived, but the true level of safety. And the truth is, being on a bus is the safest form of transportation. Or to put it differently, the families that have moved out into the suburbs so that they can have a safe place to raise their children, they made a big mistake. Because it turns out that raising children in a more multimodal urban environment is far safer than raising children out in the suburbs in an automobile-dependent community because of the difference in traffic fatality rates, the much higher traffic fatality rates to residents of suburban automobile-oriented locations. So I think to me, that's the main message to get out, is to communicate to people the safety benefits that we can gain if we become less automobile dependent and more multimodal.
We segued away from my question about models for these two communities to look toward. You mentioned Boulder. Are there any other communities?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a city in central British Columbia that has a great program, Kelowna, and they looked at their transportation, what's essentially their highway plan. So they're a typical city. It's growing at a rapid rate. It's a city that's built around that's located along a long, skinny lake, and there's a bridge that goes across that lake. And they did the analysis. What would it cost to accommodate traffic growth, including widening the bridges, by simply building their way out of that? What does it cost to build new bridges and widen all the highways to accommodate, say, 50 or 100% growth over the projected 30 years? And it was $150 million. And so this community, in order to save money, they looked at all the ways that they could encourage more efficient use of the existing roadway system. So they started implementing smart growth policies, so more housing is located in walkable communities. They improved the bus service. They're working with employers and with schools to promote use of alternative forms of transportation, and they're implementing the kind of strategies that we were talking about earlier. And so they're saving about half of that cost. They're saving something like $75 million over a couple decades by implementing smart growth and mobility management strategies.
So you're telling us in our community that we definitely need a growth girdle because we're covering land at 4 to 5-fold related to our population increase.
Well, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I will tell you that your community will save a lot of money by shifting growth so that it's more compact and more accessible. Because as people sprawl out, as development sprawls out, it becomes much more costly to serve that more dispersed housing and commercial centers with more roads and more utilities, water supply and sewage, and it costs a lot more to provide emergency services, policing and fire services in a more dispersed land use. And the people who live there are going to have to spend more on transportation. So they're going to have less money in their pockets to spend on things that provide more local economic development. And so it's to your community's benefit to encourage this more smart growth, and particularly over the long term as the price of fuel starts increasing and as the population ages and as more and more people value having a vibrant, living in a more walkable neighborhood. All of those factors contribute to the value that your community can gain by having more smart growth development.
And we can add to that building schools
and
park districts.
Those are all
taxing bodies.
Sure. And those are all important levers for smart growth. So if you want to figure out how to encourage more compact development, one of the first things you do is you look at your school policies and you ask, could we be doing more to improve the the downtown neighborhood schools and to locate schools to create more walkable communities? And can we do more to integrate the schools or the neighborhoods into creating urban villages so you have a more dynamic neighborhood? And there are many aspects of it. But what I can assure you is that if your community follows these principles, so it encourages smart growth and it encourages the development of a more diversified transportation system, and it encourages people to walk more and bicycle more and rely more on public transit, that everybody in your community can be better off. That there are economic benefits, there are social benefits, there are environmental benefits.
If you were going to leave us with a message of the first three things we should focus on as a community, what are those three things?
Well, the first thing I think you need is a clear vision of what you as a community want to become. And any marketing professional will tell you, if you want to become special, you have to figure out what special features exist here that are going to make you outstanding. And I would say you are a university towns, you're a university community with a lot of intellectual capital. You have a lot of potential for very exciting business development, and you've got this nice, as we talked about, nice bone structure. Your existing urban area is nicely designed, so it's a matter of redeveloping. I think that's what this community can be outstanding, is a college town or a university town that's redeveloping as an exciting knowledge industry center. Okay, but you have to decide, your community has to decide what that vision looks like, and then everything else falls into place. So that's part of it. A second part is to really do a good job in using the university as the starting point for your transportation and, management programs. So the university has started with some good programs. You've got the UPass, so every student and every staff at the university can ride the public transit service, but you have to do much more. You have to expand the bus service, so it's covering a larger area, so it becomes easier for everybody to use it. The university could do a lot to encourage van pooling. I think there's tremendous potential in this city, and particularly for the university, to help people who live outside the public transit service area to use van pooling to come into town. And the third thing, so those are two. The third strategy, I think, is to really take serious walkability. So you need to change the way you think of streets so that you're not afraid to do what we call road diets. That means taking a 4 or 6 lane road that right now is really just designed for maximizing automobile traffic, and adding wider sidewalks, better intersections, mid-block pedestrian refuges, so you only have to cross half of the street at a time. You cross half the street, you wait until it's clear, and then you cross the other half of the street. There's a lot you can do to implement bicycle lanes in these roads. So this is not saying that you should close off streets to car travel, but that you simply shouldn't be afraid to do things that make your streets much more of a people place rather than just a car place.
Well, you've left us with 3 very good suggestions on how to start. You've given us 2 communities that we can look toward as models, and we thank you for spending time in our community. Today, Todd Litman was part of our community planning conversation. Remember, planning matters.